They forced her badge onto the conference table like evidence and told her to step back slow and loud as if she might not understand English anymore. Linda Morrison didn't move at first. The room smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, too clean for what was happening. She felt every eye in the glass-walled boardroom settle on her shoulders. 56 years old, gray at the temples, she hadn't bothered to dye. A navy cardigan she'd worn 100 times because it fit and didn't ask questions. She watched her badge lie there, face up, her name sharp in black letters. Linda Morrison, Risk Analysis. Linda Evan Cole said, palms flat on the table, voice smooth and managerial. Early 40s, athletic build, teeth that showed when he smiled even now. This isn't personal. We just need you to leave the room. Not personal. The words landed like cold water. She heard a chair scrape. Someone cleared their throat. A phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. Through the glass, the open floor held its breath. Cubicles paused mid-keystroke. Heads angled just enough to see without being seen. Linda inhaled through her nose. Slow. Controlled. She had learned that breathing pattern years ago when panic tried to hijack her chest. Her eyes moved not to Evan, but to the far end of the table where a printed slide deck lay open. Quarter-end projections, the same numbers she'd flagged 3 weeks earlier, the same assumptions she'd warned would collapse under stress testing. She had written it in an email. Subject line precise, language careful, time stamped. She could see the error from where she stood. It pulsed on the page like a bruise. "I'm in this meeting because I was invited," she said. Her voice surprised even her. Steady, low. "I prepared the variance analysis you're discussing." Evan's smile tightened. He glanced sideways at Marissa Hale, the director who had arrived 6 months ago with a new title and a mandate to move fast. Marissa's pen hovered over her legal pad, not writing, watching, calculating. Linda Marissa said tone, clipped polite enough to cut. "We're trying to keep momentum. Let's not derail the conversation." Derail. Linda almost laughed. She didn't. She pressed her thumb into the seam of her sleeve instead. A small pain. Grounding. On the other side of the table, Jared Mills shifted in his chair. Mid-30s, expensive haircut. He didn't look at Linda. He looked at Evan, waiting for the cue. Jared had built his rise on confidence and proximity. He had also built it on ignoring emails that complicated his story. "You're asking me to step out," Linda said, eyes still on the slide because the numbers don't say what you want them to say. The room went quiet, in a way that made the lights feel louder. Evan exhaled through his nose. A practiced patience. "This environment has moved past your approach," he said. "We need people who can keep up." Keep up. Linda felt something tighten behind her eyes. Not tears. Anger. Cold, precise anger. She saw herself in that moment through their lens. Older. Slower. In the way. She thought of the mornings she arrived before anyone else, coat still damp from Ohio rain coffee, untouched because she wanted one more pass through the data. She thought of the night she left after dark, the parking garage echoing with her footsteps. She thought of the email she had sent at 12:41 in the morning, flagged urgent, ignored. She reached for her badge. Evan slid it farther away with 2 fingers casual. The movement was small. The meaning was not. "Security will escort you," Marissa said, already closing her notebook. The word escort echoed. Linda straightened. Her back didn't bend the way it used to, but it held. She took 1 step back, then another. She turned toward the glass wall. She didn't rush. She didn't look down. On the floor outside, conversation resumed in fragments. A laugh cut off too quickly. Someone pretended to sneeze. Phones came out and disappeared again. Linda walked past her desk. Her mug was still there, the chipped blue one with the faint crack along the handle. She had brought it from home because it held heat better. She left it behind. At the elevator bank, a guard she recognized nodded uncomfortable. He didn't meet her eyes. The doors closed with a soft final sound. The garage was dim and smelled of oil and cold concrete. Linda sat in her car and rested her forehead against the steering wheel. Her breath came fast now. She let it. 10 seconds, 15. Then she sat back and stared through the windshield at the gray afternoon. She thought of calling human resources. The policy language floated up in her mind, dry and circular. She thought of the file on her home computer. The emails saved the dates, the attachments. She thought of the word age and the way it never appeared in writing but lived in tone in jokes that weren't jokes in meetings she stopped being invited to. Her phone buzzed. She didn't check it. She pulled out of the garage and drove until the office tower disappeared in her rearview mirror. At a red light, her hands began to shake. She pulled into a grocery store parking lot and turned the engine off. The quiet pressed in. She reached for her phone, then thumb hovering. She hadn't planned to call him. She had promised herself she wouldn't make this his problem. But the words Evan had used replayed sharp and clean, and something inside her refused to swallow them alone. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," Robert Morrison said. His voice was warm, familiar. 63. Steady. He had a way of speaking that made rooms slow down. "You okay?" Linda closed her eyes. The question cracked her open. Not into tears, into truth. "I don't want to quit in disgrace," she said. Her voice wavered, then steadied. "And I won't stay where they're trying to erase me." There was a pause on the line. Not silence. Thought. "Where are you?" Robert asked. "By the grocery store off Riverside," she said. "I needed air." "I'm in town," he said. "I was headed to the office anyway." She opened her eyes. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said quickly. "I just needed you to know." Another pause. Longer. She could picture him then, the way his jaw set when he was making a decision, the way his eyes went distant focused. "I know," he said. "Sit tight. We'll talk." They hung up. Linda rested her hands in her lap and waited for the shaking to stop. Across town in a different building with a different view, a calendar reminder blinked on a screen. Quarterly town hall, audit review, mandatory attendance, legal present, human resources present. A line item added that morning by a chairman who did not usually attend but had chosen to this time. Back at the office, Evan Cole stood by the window and watched rain begin to fall. He felt lighter, relieved. The problem had been handled. He straightened his tie and rehearsed the language he would use if anyone asked questions. Culture. Alignment. Moving forward. He did not see the message arrive in his inbox marked high priority sent from an address he recognized but had not seen in months. He did not read the subject line that mentioned conduct and risk exposure. He did not yet understand that the numbers Linda had tried to show them were not the most dangerous thing in the room. Linda started her engine as the light rain tapped the windshield. She drove home slowly, every movement deliberate. The day was not over. She felt it. Something had shifted. Not down. Forward. By the time Linda reached her driveway, the rain had turned steady, a thin gray curtain blurring the quiet street. She sat in the car longer than necessary, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, replaying every word from the boardroom. Not the shouting. There had been none. It was the calm dismissal that stayed with her. The way Evan had spoken as if history could be edited out with a sentence. She stepped inside, hung her coat, and set her keys on the counter with care. Order mattered when everything else felt unstable. She opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. She pulled up the folder she hadn't touched in months. Emails, attachments, meeting notes, screenshots. She scrolled slowly, methodically, like she was auditing her own life. There it was. The message from 3 weeks earlier. Subject line: stress test concerns. Q3. Sent at 12:41 in the morning. She remembered writing it while the rest of the world slept, coffee gone cold, the numbers refusing to behave. She clicked it open. Read it again. The language was measured, professional, impossible to call emotional. She attached the spreadsheet Evan had praised publicly before ignoring privately. She closed the laptop without sending anything. Not yet. Her phone vibrated on the table. A text from Robert. In a meeting. Town hall moved up. I'll call after. She didn't reply. She made tea instead, hands steady now. She carried the mug to the living room and sat by the window watching headlights smear across wet pavement. The neighborhood was quiet. Retirees, young families, lives moving at a human pace. She wondered how many people had been quietly pushed aside today without anyone noticing. Across the city, the company auditorium filled with low conversation and the rustle of jackets. The stage lights were already on, 2 bright washing out faces in the front rows. Evan took a seat near the aisle, phone in hand, scrolling. Jared leaned in, murmuring something about client optics. Marissa sat with her legs crossed, posture perfect, eyes scanning the room. She smiled at a vice president in the second row and made a note on her pad. She did not look toward the back where human resources had gathered in a tight cluster, folders stacked, expressions neutral. The murmur softened as a man stepped onto the stage without introduction. He didn't need one. Robert Morrison stood tall, gray hair neatly combed, suit dark and unadorned. He didn't smile. He waited. The room quieted on instinct. "Thank you for being here," he said. His voice carried without effort. "I won't take much of your time." Evan straightened. This was unusual. Robert rarely attended these sessions. He leaned back, folding his arms, curious now. Robert's gaze moved across the audience, not lingering, not searching for approval. This morning, he continued, I reviewed a set of internal communications related to our quarter-end projections and the way dissenting analysis was handled. A ripple passed through the room. Jared's smile faltered. Marissa's pen paused midair. There is a difference, Robert said, between moving fast and moving blind. There is also a difference between leadership and intimidation. He clicked a remote. The screen behind him lit up with a chart, the same one Linda had studied, the same assumptions. He let it sit there silent. 3 weeks ago, he said a senior analyst raised concerns about this model. The concerns were accurate. They were documented. They were ignored. Evan felt heat creep up his neck. He shifted, glancing at Marissa. She kept her eyes forward. Robert's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Today, that analyst was removed from a meeting and escorted out under the pretense of alignment. A breath caught somewhere in the audience. Robert set the remote down. That analyst is my wife. The words landed heavy, not explosive. Heavy. A few people gasped. Others froze. Evan felt his stomach drop. He sat very still. Linda was not present to see the way faces changed, the way some eyes dropped in shame, the way others sharpened with fear. Robert let the silence stretch. He didn't rush it. She did not ask me to intervene, he said. She did not ask for special treatment. She asked to be heard. Marissa stood too quickly. Mr. Morrison, she began, voice tight, if there has been a misunderstanding. Robert raised a hand. She stopped. The gesture was small, absolute. This is not about marriage, he said. It is about conduct, about risk, about the culture we claim to value. He turned slightly. Human resources. A woman in the front row stood, folder in hand. An internal review has been initiated, she said. based on documented behavior including exclusion, retaliation, and misuse of authority. Evan's phone buzzed. He didn't check it. He couldn't move. Effective immediately, Robert said certain individuals are placed on administrative leave pending termination. Names followed. Evan's, Jared's, Marissa's. Each one fell like a measured blow. Not shouted, not embellished. Final. Security appeared at the doors, unobtrusive but unmistakable. A few people whispered. Someone near the back wiped their eyes. A man in accounting stared at his hands, remembering the jokes he'd laughed at the meetings he'd stayed silent in. Robert didn't gloat. He didn't smile. This company will not confuse speed with cruelty, he said, or youth with competence. If you stayed silent today, consider why. If you spoke up, you will be supported. He stepped back from the podium. The meeting ended without applause. Linda's phone rang as she rinsed her mug. Robert's name glowed on the screen. She answered. "It's done," he said. She closed her eyes. "I didn't ask you to." "I know," he said gently. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was wrong." She sat at the table, the chair creaking softly. "What happens now?" "That depends on you," he said. "There will be questions, investigations, offers." She looked at the window again. The rain had stopped. The streetlights reflected clean and sharp. "I don't want to go back," she said. The certainty surprised her. It felt like relief. "Then you won't," Robert said. "You don't owe them anything." The next weeks unfolded slowly. Evan cleared his office under watchful eyes, jaw clenched, rehearsing explanations that sounded hollow even to him. Jared's calls went unanswered. Marissa hired a lawyer. The story didn't hit the papers the way scandals usually did. It didn't need to. The damage traveled quietly through professional networks, through raised eyebrows and closed doors. Linda met with a small nonprofit on the East Side, advising them on risk without charging a fee. She helped a family-owned manufacturer rethink a loan structure that had been bleeding them dry. She slept better. She walked in the mornings. People listened when she spoke. One evening she and Robert sat on the porch, the air cool, cicadas humming. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She shook her head. "I regret staying quiet as long as I did." He nodded. They sat without speaking, the house solid behind them, the night open ahead. Somewhere across the city, someone else opened an email late at night and decided to speak up. The first letter arrived on thick paper, heavy enough to feel deliberate, stamped with a law firm's seal she recognized but had never expected to see addressed to her. Linda held it between two fingers like it might stain. She didn't open it right away. She set it on the table beside two others that had come earlier that week, one from a board she'd never applied to join, another from a consultancy in Chicago that suddenly remembered her resume from years ago. The house was quiet. Late afternoon light stretched across the floor, pale and honest. She opened the letter last. The language was careful. Apologies without admitting fault. An offer framed as resolution. Severance for a position she no longer held. A request for confidentiality. She read it once. Then again. She felt no triumph. Only the dull recognition of how quickly institutions moved when risk wore a human face. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The message came in clipped and professional, a recruiter's voice adjusting itself to warmth. "We believe your experience could be a strong fit. We'd love to talk." Linda shut the laptop and stood. She walked to the sink, rinsed her hands though they weren't dirty, and dried them slowly. The urge to respond immediately pressed at her chest. Old habits. Be agreeable. Be useful. She resisted. She stepped outside instead into the yard that needed tending. The grass was too long near the fence. She pulled on gloves and took the shears to it, the sound sharp and satisfying. Across town, Evan Cole sat in a borrowed office, the hum of an unfamiliar building in his ears. He stared at the same paragraph on his screen for the third time, unable to improve it. His phone buzzed with the text he didn't want to read. He ignored it. He replayed the town hall in his head the moment Robert Morrison had said her name. Wife. The word burned. Evan had never thought of Linda as anyone's wife. He had thought of her as a problem, a speed bump. He told himself he'd been doing his job. He told himself everyone made hard calls. The excuses tasted thin. At a coffee shop near the river, Marissa Hale met her attorney. She kept her posture impeccable, hands folded, eyes forward. She spoke of misinterpretation, of culture fit, of generational differences. The attorney listened, pen-tapping lightly, then asked about the emails. Marissa's jaw tightened. She waved a hand. Old messages, taken out of context. The attorney didn't nod. He wrote something down. Linda finished the yard as dusk crept in. She showered, changed into a sweater worn soft with age, and sat at the table again. She opened her laptop and drafted a reply to the law firm. Polite. Direct. She declined the offer of silence. She requested a formal acknowledgement of the review's findings. She attached the emails. She sent it and closed the computer before doubt could interfere. The next morning, she met with the nonprofit's director in a small office that smelled of coffee and paper. The director, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and quick hands, slid a folder across the desk. "We're bleeding," she said. "Every month. We don't know where." Linda opened the folder. She read. She listened. She asked questions. She didn't promise miracles. She promised clarity. By the end of the hour, the director exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. "Why didn't anyone see this?" she asked. Linda closed the folder gently. "They probably did," she said. "They just didn't want to say it out loud." Word traveled in quiet ways. A former colleague reached out, then another. People Linda barely remembered sent messages that started with, "I hope this isn't awkward." She answered some. She ignored others. She began to set rules for herself. No late-night emails, no meetings without agendas, no apologies for asking to be heard. Robert watched her from a distance, careful not to hover. He attended his own meetings, fielded his own calls. The board wanted statements. Investors wanted reassurance. He gave them structure and timelines. He refused spectacle. When a reporter pushed for comment, he said only that companies were measured by what they tolerated. The quote ran small, buried in the business section. It was enough. One afternoon, Linda drove downtown to return her badge. The building looked the same. Glass, steel, neutral art. The receptionist greeted her with practiced warmth that faltered when recognition hit. Linda smiled, kind and brief. She handed over the badge. The receptionist slid it into a drawer and closed it with care, as if sealing something away. In the lobby, a woman approached hesitantly. Accounting. Linda remembered her face, not her name. "I should have said something," the woman said. Her voice shook. "I didn't." Linda considered her. The urge to comfort rose and settled. "Next time," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't condemnation. It was a door left unlocked. Outside, the air was crisp. Linda breathed deeply and felt the weight lift in small increments. That evening, she and Robert cooked together, chopping vegetables in companionable silence. "You're busier now," he said lightly. She smiled. "On my terms." The phone rang mid-dinner. She ignored it. It rang again. She wiped her hands and checked the screen. "The nonprofit director," she answered. "We found it," the director said, breathless. "The leak." Exactly where you said. We're not drowning anymore. Linda closed her eyes, relief warm and unexpected. Good, she said. Now we build. After dinner, she sat at her desk and opened a new document. She titled it simply, Principles. She wrote slowly, Transparency over comfort, questions over speed, people over optics. She saved it. Weeks passed. Evan accepted a position at a smaller firm, lower title, tighter leash. He told himself it was temporary. Marissa settled her case quietly. The company updated its code of conduct. Mandatory training rolled out. Posters went up. Some changes stuck. Others faded. That was how institutions worked. Linda received an offer from a mid-sized firm to lead a new risk initiative. She read it carefully. She declined. She met with a credit union instead, then a community hospital. She began teaching a class at the local college one night a week, students young enough to be her children, eyes sharp with hunger. She told them the truth, that numbers mattered. That courage did too. On a cool Sunday morning, she and Robert walked by the river. Leaves turned overhead. "Do you ever wish you'd said something sooner?" he asked. She watched the water move steady and unbothered by what fell into it. "I wish I'd trusted myself sooner," she said. "That's different." They stopped on the bridge, hands resting on the rail. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive. Linda felt the quiet certainty settle deep. Not victory, not revenge, alignment. For the first time in a long while, her life and her values were moving in the same direction. The envelope arrived without ceremony, tucked among utility bills and grocery coupons, its return address unfamiliar but formal. Linda opened it, standing at the counter, thumb sliding under the seal, already sensing weight in the paper. Inside was a notice of deposition, her name centered. Date spelled out, location downtown. The tone was neutral, procedural, almost polite. It asked for her time, her recollection, her truth. She sat down slowly. The chair creaked. She read it twice, then folded it and placed it beside her mug. The past had a way of circling back when it realized you were no longer afraid of it. Robert found her there an hour later. Deposition notice untouched her gaze, fixed on the backyard where leaves skittered across the patio. "They're expanding the review," he said, reading the room. "It's not a fight unless someone makes it one." "I know," she said. "I just didn't expect it to feel like this again." The building downtown smelled like polished wood and old air conditioning. Linda arrived early, coat folded over her arm, hair pinned back with the same practical clip she'd worn for years. In the conference room, a court reporter tested equipment fingers, tapping eyes neutral. A corporate attorney introduced himself with a handshake that lasted exactly as long as it should. Another attorney followed, then a third. Evan's lawyer arrived last. Evan himself did not. Linda sat straight, hands folded, feet flat on the floor. When the questions began, they moved slowly, deliberately. Dates, titles, attendees. She answered without embellishment. She did not soften the truth, but she didn't sharpen it either. She described meetings where concerns were brushed aside, emails that went unanswered, jokes framed as culture. She described the day her badge was taken, and the word escort was used as if it were a favor. "Did you feel targeted because of your age?" one attorney asked. Linda paused. She looked at the ceiling light reflected in the polished table. "I felt dismissed because it was convenient," she said. "Age made it easier." They wrote that down. When the session ended, the room exhaled. The attorneys gathered their folders. One of them nodded at her, a flicker of respect. Outside, the city hummed traffic moving in practiced lines. Linda stood on the steps for a moment, coat still over her arm, breathing in the cold air. She felt tired, not broken, tired in the way you feel after lifting something heavy and setting it down for good. The calls started the next day, not from recruiters, from people she hadn't heard from in years. A former client voice shaky with gratitude, a junior analyst she'd mentored briefly now leading a team and trying not to make the same mistakes. A woman from Human Resources calling quietly asking if Linda would consider advising on a new reporting process. Linda listened. She asked questions. She agreed to meet. At the community hospital, a meeting ran long and heated. Doctors argued. Administrators worried about optics. Linda sat back, hands folded, listening until the noise revealed the shape of the problem. When she spoke, the room went still. She didn't raise her voice. She named the risk. She traced it to its source. She offered a path forward that required discomfort and promised stability. The chief financial officer rubbed his temples and nodded. "We should have done this years ago," he said. "That's how it usually goes," Linda replied. Across town, Evan Cole watched the story harden around him. Not headlines, consequences. He sat in his new office, smaller, the walls bare. His phone buzzed with a message from a former colleague asking for a reference he could not give. Evan stared at the screen, then turned it face down. He thought of Linda's face in the boardroom. Calm. Certain. He wondered when he had decided certainty was a threat. Marissa Hale accepted a consulting contract abroad. She told herself it was a fresh start. She told herself many things. Linda's evenings filled. She lectured on Thursday nights, chalk dust on her hands, students leaning forward when she paused before a difficult truth. She consulted on Saturday's spreadsheets, spread across her dining table, sunlight moving across the room as hours passed. She declined more work than she accepted. The word no felt new and powerful on her tongue. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived from the company she had left. Inside was a formal acknowledgement of the review's findings. The language was careful. The apology restrained. The commitments outlined in bullet points. Linda read it once and placed it in a drawer. She did not frame it. She did not burn it. It was evidence, not a trophy. Robert hosted a dinner for a handful of board members, the kind of quiet gathering where real decisions were made over roasted vegetables and steady conversation. Linda moved between rooms with ease, answering questions when asked, redirecting when necessary. One man leaned in, voice low. "You could have done real damage," he said, not unkindly. "I could have," she agreed. "I chose not to." Later, as they washed dishes side by side, Robert glanced at her. "You're different," he said. She smiled faintly. "I'm clearer." The class at the college ended with presentations. Students stood at the front of the room, hands shaking, voices, finding strength as they spoke. Linda watched them claim their space mistakes and all. When one faltered, she waited. When another rushed, she raised a hand. "Slow," she said. "Let them hear you." After the final applause, a student lingered. "They don't listen where I work," she said. "What do you do when they won't?" Linda gathered her notes. She met the student's eyes. "You document," she said. "You speak once, twice, if needed. And if they still don't listen, you decide how much of yourself you're willing to leave there." The river ran high after a week of rain. Linda and Robert walked its edge, the water brown and fast, carrying branches and leaves toward someplace else. "Do you miss it?" he asked, meaning the company, the structure, the title. She watched the current. "I miss being useful," she said, then corrected herself. "I am useful. I don't miss being small." A notice arrived confirming the close of the investigation. Findings substantiated, policy changes enacted, no further action required. Linda read it at the kitchen table and felt a quiet settle. Not relief. Completion. That night she opened a new document and began to write. Not a tell-all. Not a manifesto. A guide. Practical? Plain. How to speak up without burning bridges. How to recognize when a bridge was already on fire. She wrote until midnight, then saved the file and closed the laptop. Outside, the neighborhood slept. Inside, Linda turned off the light and stood in the darkness for a moment, listening to the house breathe. The future felt unremarkable in the best way. Solid. Earned. She went to bed knowing that whatever came next, she would meet it standing where she chose to stand. The first subpoena came on a Tuesday morning, folded into an envelope so stiff it felt accusatory before she opened it. Linda read the header, then the footer, then the date spelled out in full, and finally, the list of materials requested. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about patterns, decisions, who knew what and when. She set the paper down and stared at the wall until the hum of the refrigerator steadied her breathing. This was the part no one romanticized. The long middle. The place where courage was tested by repetition. By noon, 3 messages waited on her phone. A nonprofit chair asking if she could still make Thursday. A former colleague asking what to say if reporters called. A student asking for an extension. Linda answered the first yes, the second with a single sentence about truth and patience, the third with a gentle no, and an explanation about deadlines and dignity. She ate a sandwich standing up, wiped the counter, and returned to her desk. She printed the requested materials and placed them in order. She had always believed that preparation was a kind of mercy, even for people who did not deserve it. Downtown, a conference room filled again with the same faces and new ones. The tone was sharper now, not hostile, defensive. Lawyers spoke carefully as if words themselves could be held liable. Linda answered again. She described a meeting where a risk threshold had been quietly raised without documentation. She described how dissent had been reframed as resistance. She described a culture that rewarded confidence over accuracy because confidence moved faster. The court reporter's keys clicked steady and impartial. When the session ended, one attorney cleared his throat and said, "Thank you for your clarity." Linda nodded and gathered her coat. Clarity had never been the problem. Outside, the city was bright and cold. She walked 2 blocks before realizing her hands were shaking. She stopped, pressed her palms together, and waited. It passed. She took a cab home and watched the buildings slide by, glass and steel, reflecting a sky that didn't care who won. That evening, Robert came home late, shoulders tight. He loosened his tie and poured water, not wine. "They're trying to narrow the scope," he said. "Limit exposure." Quietly. Linda sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug. "It won't work," she said. Not defiant, observational. Too many people saw too much. Robert studied her. "You're certain?" "I'm experienced," she replied. The word felt earned. The next day, a headline appeared in a trade publication, careful and bloodless. Internal review. Expands at regional firm. No names, no drama. Linda read it once and closed the browser. She went to the hospital instead, where a budget meeting ran off the rails and had to be pulled back by someone willing to say the unpopular thing twice. She said it. The room resisted. She said it again. This time they listened. At the college, a guest speaker canceled last minute. Linda stepped in without notes. She spoke about incentives, about how systems taught people what mattered by what they rewarded. She spoke about the quiet violence of exclusion. She did not name her former company. The students leaned forward anyway. One raised a hand and asked what to do when leadership punished honesty. Linda didn't soften it. "You decide who you want to be," she said. "Then you decide where you can be that person without shrinking." Across the city, Evan Cole sat through an interview he didn't get. The questions were polite. The silences were not. He left with a practiced smile and a knot in his chest he couldn't untie. On the sidewalk, he opened his phone and scrolled until he found Linda's number, then closed the app. He had imagined an apology many times. He had not imagined earning forgiveness. Marissa Hale boarded a plane and watched the city disappear under clouds. She told herself she would be different elsewhere. She told herself the past was context, not indictment. The thought comforted her until it didn't. The subpoenas multiplied, not to Linda alone, to managers, to directors, to human resources. Calendars filled, emails surfaced. Someone leaked a recording, not explosive, just enough. The board issued another statement. Training was accelerated. An ombuds's office announced expanded authority. Linda read the announcements and felt the familiar tug of skepticism. She knew how quickly language could become theater. She also knew that theater could change behavior if the audience feared consequences. One afternoon, she received an invitation she hadn't expected. A closed-door roundtable with regulators and industry leaders off the record. She stared at the email, then forwarded it to Robert with a single question. Thoughts? He called immediately. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I should." The round table was held in a windowless room with soft lighting and bad coffee. The introductions were formal, titles exchanged. Linda listened as men with impressive resumes spoke about innovation and growth. When it was her turn, she didn't grandstand. She described the mechanics of failure, how shortcuts metastasized, how fear dressed itself up as efficiency. She spoke of age without using the word of how institutions quietly learned to ignore people who refused to perform urgency. The room grew still. A regulator asked for specifics. Linda gave them. Afterward, a woman from a federal agency walked with her to the elevator. "You're braver than most," she said. Linda pressed the button. "I'm tired of being careful," she replied. The phone rang late that night. An unfamiliar number. Linda considered letting it go. She answered. "Ms. Morrison," a man said, voice tight. "This is counsel for the firm. We'd like to discuss terms." "Send them," Linda said, "in writing." She slept poorly. Dreams crowded in half-remembered meetings and flickering screens. In the morning, she rose early and walked. The river was high again, churning. She matched her steps to her breath until the noise in her head settled. The terms arrived. Broader acknowledgement, structural changes, independent oversight, a commitment to publish findings. Linda read slowly. She marked the margins with a pencil, circling what mattered and crossing out what didn't. She sent it back with revisions and a note that said only, "These are the conditions under which trust can begin." Robert watched her from the doorway, admiration mixed with concern. "You don't owe them a blueprint," he said. She capped the pencil. "Someone has to draw the map," she said. "Otherwise, we keep pretending the terrain is flat." Days later, the firm accepted most of the terms. Not all. Linda agreed anyway. Not because it was enough. Because it was forward. She understood compromise when she saw it. She also understood leverage, and she was done using it. The announcement came quietly, then spread. Findings substantiated. Leadership changes enacted. Oversight established. The story moved on as stories do. Linda did not give interviews. She sent a brief note to the nonprofit chair canceling Thursday and rescheduling for next week. She told the students there would be a guest lecture on accountability. She made soup and froze half. That evening, she and Robert sat at the kitchen table, papers stacked neatly, the work done for the day. "Are you relieved?" he asked. She considered it. "I'm resolved," she said. "Relief implies it's over." He nodded. Outside, the streetlight flickered, then steadied. Linda gathered the documents and filed them away. Not to forget. To remember properly. The long middle had not broken her. It had sharpened her. And whatever came next, she would meet it with the same quiet insistence that had carried her this far. The morning Linda was scheduled to testify before the state committee, the sky was the color of dull steel, low and unpromising. She dressed without ceremony, choosing the gray suit she'd worn to depositions and classrooms alike. It fit, not because it impressed. She paused at the mirror only long enough to check that her hair was pinned back, and her face said what she felt. Ready, not righteous. The hearing room buzzed with restrained urgency. Staffers moved and practiced arcs. Microphones were tested. A row of reporters sat behind a rope. Notebooks open eyes alert. Linda took her seat at the witness table and folded her hands. The chair across from her was empty. She noticed the absence without relief. Confrontations were not always face-to-face. Often they arrived as policy language and procedural delay. The chair of the committee called the session to order. The oath was administered. Linda spoke the words without flourish. When questions came, they came from different angles, some sharp, some sincere. She answered the same way she always had. She described how risk migrated when ignored, how organizations learned to prize velocity over verification, how dissent once framed as obstruction became a liability rather than a safeguard. She did not name villains. She named mechanisms. A senator leaned forward. "What would you change?" he asked. If you had the authority, Linda considered the microphone. "I would slow things down where speed hides error," she said. "I would separate performance from popularity. And I would protect the people who raise their hands before the damage is public." Pens scratched. A camera clicked. The chair thanked her and called the next witness. Linda stepped back, pulse steady, a small ache blooming between her shoulders. It was done. Not finished. Done. Outside, a gust of wind cut through the plaza. Linda pulled her coat tighter and walked past the reporters without stopping. She had learned the difference between being heard and being consumed. At home, she made soup and left it simmering while she answered emails. The messages were thoughtful now, measured. People asked for guidance, not absolution. She replied with questions of her own. What are you willing to change? What are you willing to lose? That afternoon, a request arrived she hadn't anticipated. Evan Cole wanted to meet. The email was brief. No excuses, no conditions. Linda read it twice, then closed the laptop. She thought of the long months of small dismissals, the final escort, the room full of eyes. She thought of the student who'd asked how to survive a place that punished honesty. She replied with a single line. Tomorrow, noon, public place. The cafe was bright and loud enough to prevent secrets. Evan arrived early and stood when he saw her. He looked thinner, older. His suit was the same cut, the confidence altered. They ordered coffee and sat. For a moment, neither spoke. I'm sorry, Evan said finally. He didn't rush it. He didn't hedge. I thought speed was leadership. I thought certainty was strength. I was wrong. Linda watched his hands. They trembled, then steadied. Why now? She asked. He exhaled. Because I keep replaying that meeting, he said. And because every place I go asks the same questions. Not about results, about culture. Linda nodded. Apologies matter, she said. Change matters more. He met her gaze. Tell me what to do. She didn't smile. That's not how it works, she said. You decide who you want to be when it costs you something. Then you act like that person even when no one is watching. They drank their coffee. The noise of the cafe filled the spaces words couldn't. When they stood, Evan extended a hand. Linda shook it, brief, clean. They left separately. Weeks layered over one another. The firm released a public summary of findings. Training became policy, policy became audits, audits became habits for some. Others resisted quietly, waiting for attention to drift. Linda didn't wait. She joined an advisory council that met quarterly and asked better questions than most. She taught a workshop on risk ethics that filled faster than expected. She turned down a book deal with a polite refusal and an explanation she didn't owe. At the college, her class staged a mock board meeting. Students argued passionately, some reckless, some cautious. Linda let them clash, then stopped the exercise and asked a simple question. "Who paid the price for your choice?" The room fell quiet. They began again differently. Robert watched the arc from his own seat, careful not to claim it. He handled calls from investors and regulators with the same discipline he'd used his whole career. He did not protect Linda from consequence. He protected process. When a colleague praised him for standing by his wife, he corrected them. "She stood by herself," he said. "I stood by the rules." One evening, after a long day of meetings and emails, Linda walked alone by the river. The water moved faster now, carrying debris from upstream. She stopped on the bridge and leaned on the rail. She felt the old pull toward invisibility and recognized it for what it was: habit, not truth. She stayed until the light faded and the city's reflection broke into 1,000 pieces on the surface. The call came late, just as she was turning off the kitchen light. "An unfamiliar number," she answered. "Ms. Morrison," a woman said, voice steady. "This is the federal office. We're establishing an independent review panel. We'd like you to serve." Linda closed her eyes. The weight of it settled. Not flattery. Responsibility. "What would that require?" she asked. "Time," the woman said. "And candor." Linda looked around the quiet kitchen, the stack of papers neatly filed, the calendar with white space she'd fought to protect. "Send the details," she said. "I'll read them." She slept well that night. The panel convened in a modest building with no view. The work was unglamorous: charts, testimony, footnotes. Linda listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was to clarify, to anchor the conversation to consequences. She pushed back when language softened harm into abstraction. She insisted on timelines and accountability. The final report was dense and precise. It recommended changes that would make some people uncomfortable for a long time. That was the point. When it was released, the coverage was brief. A paragraph here, a quote there. The news cycle moved on. Linda did not. She met with organizations willing to implement the recommendations and declined those looking for cover. She learned to recognize sincerity by what it cost. On a Sunday afternoon, Robert grilled vegetables while Linda set the table. The air smelled like summer. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. She smiled. "This is the quiet," she said, gesturing to the yard, the house, the work that felt aligned. "Noise is when you pretend." They ate. They talked about ordinary things. A neighbor waved. The world continued. Later, Linda opened the document she'd been drafting for months. The guide had grown into something sturdier. She revised a section on whistleblowing, adding a line she'd learned the hard way. "Speak early. Document always. Choose allies who value truth over tempo." She saved the file and sent it to the council with a note offering it freely. The night settled. Linda turned off the light and stood for a moment, listening to the house breathe. She felt the same quiet insistence that had carried her from a boardroom door to a witness table and beyond. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vengeance. It was alignment made durable. And she knew with a certainty that did not need permission that she would keep choosing it again and again, no matter who was watching. The invitation arrived by courier, not email, a slim folder delivered by a man who waited just long enough to confirm her name before leaving. Linda opened it at the kitchen table, the late afternoon light slanting across the wood. Inside was a schedule, a non-disclosure agreement, and a note written in a careful hand. National Advisory Session. Closed. Limited attendance. Her name appeared without a title. She noticed that first. She signed the agreement, made a copy, and placed it in the drawer with the others. The work had begun to resemble itself. Quiet, procedural, heavy in its own way. She packed a notebook, 2 pens, and the gray suit again. She left the house before dawn, the street empty, the air sharp enough to wake her fully. The session was held in a federal building that looked like it had been designed to resist memory. Windowless corridors, neutral carpet, a conference room long enough to discourage intimacy. The table was already crowded when she arrived. Regulators, industry veterans, a few academics. Faces she recognized from articles, from hearings, from footnotes. Conversations dipped as she took her seat. Not reverence. Appraisal. The chair opened with ground rules. Off the record. Speak plainly. No press. No attribution. Linda listened. The first hour was all framing. Definitions argued and revised. Someone used the word innovation as a shield. Someone else used compliance like a threat. Linda waited. She had learned that impatience often disguised itself as urgency. When she spoke, it was to ask a question no one had asked yet. Who bears the cost when incentives fail, she said, voice even. And how long do we expect them to carry it before we intervene? The room stilled. A man across the table leaned back, arms crossed. A woman beside him nodded once, small and decisive. The discussion shifted. Not dramatically, directionally. They moved from abstractions to examples, from examples to patterns. Linda traced those patterns to decisions made quietly, rewarded loudly. She named the gap between policy and practice without apology. During the break, a senior regulator approached her by the coffee urn. "You're not interested in headlines," he said. "No," Linda replied. "I'm interested in habits." He smiled a little rueful. "Those are harder. That's why they last," she said. The session ended without consensus. It always did. But there were next steps. Working groups. Deadlines. A calendar invite that would become a recurring fixture. Linda left with a stack of documents and the familiar weight between her shoulders. Responsibility had a physical presence. She welcomed it. At home, Robert listened as she recounted the day, not interrupting, asking only when she paused. "They'll resist," he said finally. "They already are," she replied. "That's how you know you're close." The next weeks brought a different kind of pressure. Not subpoenas. Invitations. Panels. White papers with flattering prefaces. Linda accepted some, declined others. She learned to read intent quickly. If a request asked her to validate rather than interrogate, she said no. If it asked her to sit in discomfort and name things plainly, she said yes. At the college, her students followed the hearings with new eyes. One brought in an article and slid it across the desk. "They're quoting you," he said, "equal parts awe and fear." Linda glanced at the pull quote. It was accurate. That mattered. "Quoting isn't the same as listening," she said. "You'll learn the difference." She noticed changes there, too. A professor who had once dismissed her course as practical began attending. The dean asked about expanding the program. Linda insisted on safeguards. Smaller classes, clear objectives. Support for students who challenged authority respectfully. The dean hesitated, then agreed. Conditions mattered. One evening, as Linda prepared notes for the next advisory meeting, her phone rang. Unknown number, she answered. "Ms. Morrison," a woman said, voice tight. "I was told you might talk to me." "Who told you?" Linda asked. "A colleague," the woman said. "I'm in compliance." "Or I was." "I found something. They're telling me to let it go." Linda listened. She asked careful questions. Dates, documents. Who knew? She did not promise protection she could not give. She explained options, risks. The cost of silence and the cost of speech. When the call ended, Linda sat back and closed her eyes. The work had found her again. The next morning, she connected the woman with counsel, and an ombud's office that actually had teeth. She followed up without hovering. She knew how quickly courage could collapse under isolation. She made sure the woman was not alone. Across the city, Evan Cole watched the advisory session summary circulate internally at his new firm. The language was sharper now, less forgiving. He felt a twist of something like regret, something like resolve. He requested a meeting with his team and spoke differently than he used to. Slower, more questions, fewer assumptions. It felt awkward. It felt necessary. At the federal building, drafts multiplied. Red lines, footnotes. Linda argued for clarity over compromise. She lost some battles, won others. She learned which hills mattered. She insisted on protections for older workers without naming age. She framed it as institutional memory, as risk mitigation. The language stuck. One night after a long session, Linda walked alone through the parking garage, heels echoing. She thought of the boardroom door closing months ago, the escort that never came, the badge left behind. She realized she no longer flinched at the memory. It had become data, context, fuel. At home, she found Robert reading in the living room, glasses perched low. "You look tired," he said. "I am," she said. "The good kind." They sat together without speaking. The house held their quiet easily. The following week, the advisory group released interim guidance. It was dense and cautious and already being debated. Linda watched the reactions with measured interest. Some praised it, some attacked it, some tried to water it down before it hardened. She prepared for the next meeting. A letter arrived from the woman in compliance. 2 lines. "Thank you." They listened. Linda folded it and placed it in the drawer with the others. Evidence, not trophies. At the college, the semester ended. Students presented final projects that wrestled honestly with power and consequence. Linda graded late into the night, writing comments that were firm and generous. She closed the last folder and turned off the desk lamp. On a Saturday morning, she and Robert walked the farmer's market, the air full of noise and color. A stranger stopped her. "You're the one," the woman said, eyes bright. "From the hearing." Linda nodded, unsure. "Thank you," the woman said simply. Then she moved on. Linda stood still for a moment, the sounds of the market rushing back in. She felt the shape of the work larger than any room she'd been in, larger than any title she'd refused. She took Robert's hand and kept walking. That night she opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence at the top of a new page. Change doesn't arrive as applause. It arrives as repetition. She underlined it once and closed the book, ready for the next day. The call came just after dawn, the phone vibrating against the nightstand with a persistence that felt intentional. Linda answered without sitting up. "This is Linda." "Ms. Morrison," the voice said, calm and practiced. "We need to brief you before the guidance goes public." She closed her eyes and listened as the day assembled itself. There would be a release. There would be reactions. There would be pressure to soften language before it hardened into expectation. She thanked the caller, wrote the time on a scrap of paper, and stood. The house was quiet. She made coffee and waited for it to finish before doing anything else. Small rituals anchored big days. The briefing was efficient. Slides, talking points, anticipated objections. Linda asked for the appendix and read it while the others spoke. The risk wasn't in what they said. It was in what they left unsaid. When it was her turn, she suggested one change, then another. Remove the euphemism. Add the timeline. Replace intent with obligation. Silence followed, then agreement. The edits were made. By mid-morning, the guidance went live. Within minutes, her inbox filled. Praise framed as relief. Criticism framed as concern. A few messages cut closer to the bone, warning her about overreach, about unintended consequences, about patience. She replied to none of them. She forwarded the most substantive questions to the working group and turned to the next task. At the college, a student waited outside her office, shoulders tight. "They're pushing back," he said without greeting. "My internship." I raised a concern. "Now they're saying I'm not a fit." Linda motioned him inside and closed the door. She listened. She asked for dates. She asked for what was written and what was implied. She asked what he wanted, not justice, not vindication. What he wanted. He stared at the floor. "I want to stay and do the work he said, without lying." Linda nodded. "Then you document," she said. "You ask for clarity in writing, you give them a chance to respond, and you prepare for the possibility that they won't." He swallowed. "And if they don't, then you choose yourself," she said. "That choice is not a failure." He left steadier than he arrived. Linda sat back and felt the familiar ache return, the one that came with knowing how much courage cost before it paid dividends. In the afternoon, a network requested an interview. She declined politely. Another asked for an op-ed. She requested a draft of the headline first. When it arrived, she declined again. She had learned how easily nuance evaporated under urgency. The work mattered more than the credit. Across town, the firm released a memo aligning itself with the guidance. The language was careful, almost enthusiastic. Training schedules were announced. A hotline expanded. Linda read it with measured interest. Alignment announced was not alignment achieved. She marked her calendar to check again in 3 months. At the advisory meeting that week, the room felt different, less defensive. Not cooperative yet. Curious. Linda presented a case study without naming names. She traced how a single decision cascaded, how a dismissed warning became a headline months later. She let the data speak. When questions came, she answered them plainly. When someone suggested compromise, she asked who would absorb the risk. The answer, when honest, ended the debate. Afterward, a younger regulator walked with her to the elevator. "You don't mind being unpopular," he said, half admiring, half wary. "I mind being wrong," Linda replied. "Unpopular passes." That evening, she and Robert ate on the back porch plates balanced on their knees. The cicadas were loud. "You're carrying more," he said gently. "So is everyone," she replied. "They're just pretending not to notice." The next morning, the blowback arrived. An industry group issued a statement calling the guidance impractical. A trade association warned of chilling effects. Linda read both, then pulled the underlying data. She found the gaps. She wrote a response for the working group, precise and unadorned. It went out without her name attached. She preferred it that way. Late that night, her phone rang. The woman from compliance again. This time, her voice shook with relief. "They opened a formal inquiry," she said. "I'm not alone anymore." Linda closed her eyes. "Good," she said. "Stay that way." The next day brought an unexpected invitation. A closed session with a board that had once ignored her emails. Linda considered declining. Then she remembered the bridge she'd left unlocked. She accepted on one condition. The agenda would include dissent as a standing item. The condition was met. The session was tense. Familiar faces, older now. Apologies offered without ownership. Linda listened, then spoke once. She described what it felt like to be escorted from a room where the numbers were correct. She did not dramatize it. She did not soften it. The room absorbed the words in silence. When a director asked what she wanted from them, she answered honestly. Consistency, she said, and proof. Weeks layered into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Linda taught. She advised. She reviewed drafts and returned them with notes that asked better questions than the margins allowed. She slept. She walked. She learned to leave her phone in another room. On a rainy afternoon, she received a message from Evan. Not a request, a report. He had implemented a review process at his new firm. It was early. It was imperfect. He thanked her for the conversation they'd had. She replied with a single sentence. "Keep going." The semester resumed. Linda stood at the front of the classroom and began with a story that did not include her. She watched students wrestle with it, saw recognition dawn. She ended with a question that stayed with them after the bell. Who decides what matters when the clock is loud? One evening, as she closed her notebook, Robert leaned in the doorway. "You look lighter," he said. "I'm learning where to put the weight," she replied. The guidance took hold in uneven ways. Some organizations embraced it, others complied on paper and resisted in practice. Linda tracked the difference. She sent quiet notes. She followed up. She refused to confuse motion with progress. At the farmer's market, the same woman stopped her again. This time she smiled and kept walking. Linda felt the work settle into its proper scale. Not savior, not villain, participant. That night, she wrote in her notebook and underlined the sentence once more. Change doesn't arrive as applause. It arrives as repetition. She closed the book and turned off the light, ready for whatever the next morning would ask of her. The audit findings were released on a quiet Friday afternoon, timed to soften the impact but not the meaning. Linda read the executive summary once, then again, then scrolled past the legal language to the appendices where the truth usually lived. The conclusions were clear. Systemic failures, retaliation patterns, incentives misaligned with safety, corrective actions mandated, oversight extended. She felt no rush of victory, only a steady exhale like setting down a load she'd carried longer than she realized. By evening, messages began to stack, some careful, some clumsy, a few defensive. Linda answered none. She cooked, cleaned as she went, and opened a bottle of water instead of wine. The house felt grounded walls, holding the day without echo. She sat at the table and wrote a short note to the advisory group, thanking them for the discipline to finish what they started. She attached nothing. The work spoke for itself. Across the city, reactions unfolded unevenly. A board convened an emergency call and argued over phrasing. Another announced reforms with a press release and no budget. A third quietly replaced leadership and hired people who asked uncomfortable questions. Linda tracked the differences not as scorekeeping but as data. Patterns mattered. Behavior over time mattered more. At the college, the semester's midpoint brought stress and shortcuts. Linda watched students negotiate deadlines and temptation. She held office hours longer than scheduled and asked fewer questions, letting them fill the space. One student admitted to smoothing a dataset to meet expectations. Linda didn't scold. She asked who would be harmed by the smoothing. The student's answer changed the rest of the conversation. The phone rang late one night, an unfamiliar number. Linda answered, voice calm. "Ms. Morrison, a man said, 'breath tight.' I was told you'd listen." He spoke quickly, a manager in logistics who had been warned to stop documenting delays. He was scared. He was tired. Linda listened until his words slowed. She explained options, boundaries, and the cost of each path. She did not promise safety. She promised honesty. When the call ended, she sat in the dark for a moment and let the weight pass through her instead of lodging. The next morning, Robert read the paper at the kitchen counter, glasses low. "They're quoting the report," he said. "Not you." "Good," Linda replied, pouring coffee. "Quoting people turns into noise." He watched her with the quiet pride he reserved for things that mattered. "Do you ever think about what you gave up?" he asked. She considered it. "I think about what I stopped paying," she said. "There's a difference." The advisory council met again, smaller this time. Less ceremony, more work. Linda pushed for a pilot program that would test protections before expanding them. Someone objected on cost. Linda asked for the cost of not acting. The objection fell apart under arithmetic. They moved forward. That afternoon, she received an email she hadn't expected. The firm she'd left invited her to a listening session, not a panel, not a keynote, a closed room with people who had stayed and people who had been promoted since. Linda read the invitation twice and accepted with conditions. No recording, no press. Questions submitted in advance. The firm agreed. The session was awkward by design. Chairs in a circle. No podium. No slides. Linda sat and waited. A junior manager spoke first, voice thin. "We didn't know how to stop it," she said. "We were told to trust the process." Linda nodded. "Processes are made of people," she said. "When they fail, people decide whether to repair them or hide the damage." An older director spoke next, defensive, at first then quieter. "We thought speed would save us," he said. Linda met his gaze. "Speed saves time," she said. "It doesn't save trust." They talked for 2 hours. Some listened, some bristled. One apologized without excuse. Another deflected until the room stopped following. Linda left without resolution and without regret. Seeds didn't need applause to grow. Weeks passed. The guidance began to show teeth. A company lost a contract after failing an audit. Another gained credibility by publishing dissent and acting on it. Linda advised where she could and stepped back where she should. She learned to recognize when presence helped and when absence forced accountability. At home, the rhythm returned. Walks by the river, meals planned loosely, a calendar that held white space. Linda began to draft a curriculum outline for a course she'd been asked to design. Risk and responsibility. She wrote the first lecture last, starting with consequences instead of theory. One afternoon, Evan Cole emailed again. This time he attached a document, a code of conduct revision. He asked for comments. Linda skimmed it and marked 3 sections: clarity, enforcement, reporting. She returned it with notes and no preface. An hour later, he replied with thanks and a promise to implement. She hoped he would. She didn't need to believe. The industry shifted in small, visible ways. Town halls added time for dissent. Agendas listed risk first. Some of it was performance. Some of it was learning. Linda treated both as starting points. On a cold evening, she and Robert attended a small gathering at a friend's house. The conversation drifted to work as it did. Someone asked Linda how it felt to be right all along. The question made her uncomfortable. It felt lonely, she said, and expensive. The room went quiet, then nodded. The truth had a way of doing that. Later, as they drove home, Robert reached for her hand. "You okay?" he asked. She squeezed back. "I am," she said. "I just don't want the story to end with me." It didn't. The calls kept coming. Not as emergencies, as inquiries. Linda began to refer some away, building a small network of people who asked good questions and didn't need credit. She watched them take on work and felt the satisfaction of distribution. Power shared lasted longer. At the college, the final projects were better than the syllabus deserved. Students argued with evidence and humility. Linda graded carefully and wrote comments that asked what they would do when it was harder than this. She returned the papers and closed the folder with a sense of completion. The audit's follow-up report landed quietly, confirming progress and naming gaps. Linda read it and sent a single sentence to the council. "Keep pressure where it counts." She received a thumbs-up emoji in response and smiled despite herself. On a Sunday morning, she stood on the bridge again, the river lower now calmer. She leaned on the rail and watched a branch catch, then slip free. She thought of the boardroom door, the escort that never came the months that followed. She felt the memory without flinching. It had become context, not wound. That night, she opened her notebook and wrote a final line beneath the underlined sentence she'd carried for months. Change doesn't arrive as applause, it arrives as repetition. Then she added, and it stays when people refuse to look away. She closed the book and turned off the light, ready for the last stretch, whatever shape it chose to take. The morning the final report was archived, Linda woke before the alarm and lay still, listening to the house breathe. No calls, no urgent emails. The work had reached a natural pause, not an ending, just a place where momentum could be handed off without fear of collapse. She rose dressed and made coffee, letting the routine set the tone. Outside, the street was quiet, the early light clean and honest. She spent the first hour reviewing notes for the new course she would teach in the fall. Not a victory lap. A syllabus built around decisions and consequences case studies that refused to flatter anyone. She cut what felt performative and kept what was durable. When she finished, she saved the file and closed the laptop without second-guessing. Clarity had become a habit. By mid-morning, a message arrived from the advisory council. The pilot program would expand nationally. Oversight language would be standardized. A timeline attached. Linda read it carefully, then forwarded it to two people who had carried the work quietly and deserved the next seat at the table. She added a note that said only, "Your turn." Distribution was the point. She drove to the college and walked the long hallway that still smelled faintly of chalk and floor cleaner. In her classroom, students gathered early, talking in low voices. She waited until they settled. Today was not about her. She opened with a scenario and let the room work through it. When the conversation drifted toward shortcuts, she steered it back to cost. When it veered toward fear, she named it. The bell rang, and no one moved. That was how she knew the lesson had landed. At lunch, she met Robert at a small diner near campus. They ordered without looking at the menu. He studied her face. "You're lighter," he said. "I'm steadier," she replied. "There's a difference." They talked about ordinary things. Groceries, a neighbor's new dog, plans for the weekend. The absence of crisis made room for life. When they left, Linda paused on the sidewalk and watched students pass backpacks, slung futures heavy and unformed. She felt protective without being possessive. The work would outlast her if she let it. In the afternoon, she visited the nonprofit she'd helped months earlier. The director greeted her with a tired smile that held relief. Numbers were up. Waste was down. The board was learning to ask better questions. Linda listened more than she spoke, asked for the data, and confirmed the safeguards. Progress, she had learned, needed maintenance. A courier arrived at home with a slim package addressed to her. Inside was a copy of the final report, bound simply no fanfare. Linda ran her fingers along the spine and placed it on the shelf beside others she rarely touched. Evidence, not monument. As evening approached, the phone rang. Evan's number. She answered. He spoke briefly, reporting on a change implemented. An uncomfortable meeting held a line crossed back the right way. Linda listened and acknowledged. "Keep going," she said, and meant it. Redemption was not hers to grant, but effort could be recognized. Later, she walked by the river alone. The water moved with an unhurried certainty, carrying what it carried, releasing what it couldn't keep. She stopped on the bridge and rested her hands on the rail. The memory of the boardroom door rose and fell without sting. She felt gratitude for the version of herself who had refused to shrink and compassion for the version who had learned to speak without permission. Both had been necessary. At home, Robert was in the kitchen chopping vegetables. She joined him, the rhythm easy. "What's next?" he asked, not pressing. Linda considered the question as a statement, not a demand. "More of this," she said. "Less noise, better habits." They ate and cleaned up together. The night settled without ceremony. Linda returned to her desk and opened the notebook that had carried her through the long middle. She reread the underlined sentence and the line beneath it. Change doesn't arrive as applause. It arrives as repetition, and it stays when people refuse to look away. She added one final note in the margin. pass it on. She closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. The house held the quiet easily. Whatever came next would not need a spotlight. It would need people willing to do the work again and again without needing credit, without pretending speed was wisdom. Linda felt ready for that kind of future, the ordinary kind that endures. If this story moved you, tap like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts by commenting with 3 words: Stand, Tell, Truth.